All right, details. I mean, they matter, right? I once took a spelling test, and one of the words was Mayflower. Okay, I know how to spell Mayflower, too easy. But I missed the word. I missed the word on the spelling test. Why? Because apparently when I wrote it down, my handwriting wasn't that great, and my Y in Mayflower didn't look like it had enough of a curve on it, so the teacher thought I was writing Matt Flower. I was incensed. This is unjust. I wanted my point back. But it was a detail. I mean, the reality is, and the teacher pointed out, what difference does it make if you can spell a word correctly but nobody can read it? In the Army, I was taught to write my numbers, my numerals, with a 0 having a slash through it, a 7 having a sideways dash in the middle. I was also taught when I'm on the radio to say the word niner instead of 9. Why? Normal people don't do that. Yeah, but you know what? Normal people sling things on paper or say things too fast. So if you're calling in for artillery or close air support using grid coordinates and the rushed version of a 0 looks more like a 6, or the rushed version of a 7 looks like a 2, or someone misunderstands you on the radio thinking you said 5 instead of 9, well then you're dropping bombs in the wrong spot. So yeah, details matter. Now, some folks like to say the devil's in the details. Not me. I believe that God's in the details. I mean, details are what makes the big picture come together. Details are what makes bad get better and good become great. That sounds a lot more like a godly approach than anything else, just saying. Now, I think I've probably told some folks before, but my first real paycheck came from Chick-fil-A in Huntsville in what used to be called Parkway City Mall when I was 16 years old. It was an education, let me tell you. I mean, it was truly the wheels of commerce in action, but it was also an education in paying attention to details. You might think the preparation of a mere chicken sandwich only has so many things to think about. Nay. I mean, it's all about the details. Are the buns fresh? 2 pickle slices per sandwich. How many do we have on hand for the big Christmas rush that's about to start? When do we need to change out all the oil? Preparation of the chicken alone was, detailed and thorough, with each one being thoroughly dipped and battered and cooked for the correct time. And that's just the sandwich. Then there's stocking, receiving shipment, scheduling staff. Who makes the carrot and raisin salad? By the way, I'm still mad they don't do that. And then the dining room, the refill of the napkins, make sure the registers have adequate change. All the while, keep a smile on your face and tell folks it's your pleasure to serve them. It's a whole lot for a 16-year-old learning about the world, but yeah, I learned that details matter. And then, of course, there's politics. I've spent some time there myself. Do details matter in politics? Absolutely. So the November election is right around the corner. Democrats have finally figured out they can't win with Joe, so they called in the relief pitcher of Kamala Harris, and we actually get to see whether or not she's going to live up to the hype. Kamala takes the stage next to Donald Trump pretty soon for a big to-do with a debate. She's avoided giving any real details on her policies. But we can look back and we can see what she has said and done in the past, and it's quite something when you actually take the time to see the details. Look, it's one thing to look at a candidate's advertisements and their billboards, but it's quite another to actually see the person in living color, how they do the actions themselves, the history of their time in service, the past achievements, the life experiences. They all really add up to match the glossy mail-outs that came in your mailbox? Probably not. It's details, my friend. I mean, it's really so much about the details. And the real trick is look behind the curtain. What does their life tell you? What does their prior public image tell you? What have they actually done? Are they on the record in any way at all? Well, the hope for the Kamala Harris-Tim Walz campaign right now is that you won't do that. Because everyone has that moment they don't want to have to explain, right? Or that less than flattering photo, but their policies are supposed to be what they stand for. Allegedly, policies follow principles. Actions are derived from deeply held convictions. If that's true, then what can we see of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz? I can tell you right now, it has nothing to do with anything that we conservatives stand for. It's part of why I say that it's more important to vote on policy than on personality. The classic example of why I say that is currently sitting in the Oval Office right now, except that, when he's back out on the beach. I mean, think about it. So-called never-Trump Republicans and independents, they were more concerned back in 2020 about mean tweets and big personalities, and we must restore decorum, they shouted. We must have a change in the tone in D.C., they cried. How'd that work out for them? 4 years later, there's been some buyer's remorse. Let me ask you this. If If you went to church on Sunday and there was a new pastor, would you feel like things were different? Maybe too different? Would it make you mad? I mean, who's this man in the pulpit? The real question would be, what will that pastor preach and stand for? And if you don't feel comfortable, do you just go find another church? Maybe. There are choices. But let me ask you this. If one Sunday morning you didn't like the pastor, would you choose instead to renounce your faith and reject God altogether? I would hope not. Because if that was your reaction, then I would have to question your faith in general. You see, people change, places change, principles and matters, though, of core belief are supposed to be bedrocks that are immovable. You don't change them out based on personality differences. Principles are the details, and they transcend personality. All right, so recently, longtime Republican Liz Cheney came out and endorsed Kamala Harris. A person who just 4 years ago, she personally derided on her own social media account. In August of 2020, Liz Cheney went out on what was then called Twitter and said this. She said, quote, "Kamala Harris is a radical liberal who would raise taxes, take away guns and health insurance, and explode the size and power of the federal government." She went on to say she wants to recreate America in the image of what's happening on the streets of Portland and Seattle. We won't give her the chance. Wow. That's pretty clear where Liz stood on the policies back then, right? Liz Cheney, what changed? Here's the deal. Either Cheney just sacrificed her principles, or Harris changed her policies, or maybe it's just that Cheney is stuck in the idea that people will follow her lead if she sacrifices her principles and denies the policies that we know are there and just votes on personality. Well, apparently, by the way, the Cheney family, they stick together, right? So not long after Liz sacrificed her principles for pettiness, her father came out and did likewise. Former Republican Vice President Dick Cheney, who served in the Bush administration, he loathes Trump, and it shows, and I get it. All those things that he said, that he stood for, Dick Cheney says they're not as important now as making sure that the man he despises is defeated. And I do get it. If you believe that Trump offended your daughter, and that was also mutual, by the way, then maybe you just stay quiet and don't vote because your principles are still going to be put into action, or are they? Dick Cheney said this. He said, "As citizens, we each have a duty to put our country above partisanship to defend our Constitution. That is why I'll be casting my vote for Vice President Kamala Harris." Okay, sure. Because you really believe that Kamala Harris will do all that she can to jump on board with the Republican agenda you supported for years. Lower taxes, smaller government, strong defense. Sure. He could have stayed silent. Could have just bit his tongue and hoped for the principles to carry on, but he lashed out because of the man. He lost sight of the details, and he got embedded in the idea of the personality. To throw everything away that you allegedly stand for, to openly support someone who stands for just the opposite, it actually calls your principles into belief. I mean, were they really core principles at all? Or were they just slogans for back in your day of politics? Is there a perfect candidate? I'm not aware of one. Look, the day of picking and choosing ended with the primary, and now for the general election, you have two choices, really. Two actual choices. It's Trump or Harris. And you know what they stand for because they tell you, and they've showed you, and you can actually see the results. It is rare in history to be in the position we're in right now, where you have two candidates on the stage, both pursuing the same office, who have such clearly defined and very recent records in that same office. You may not like Harris, but you can see what she's done and not done. You may not like Trump, but you can see what he's done and not done. So if that's the case, all you can really do is measure it against your principles. Take a look at what's happened most recently and decide, are your principles being met? Set aside the personality, set aside whether you won or not in the primary, and you look at it and go, this person will do more of what I believe in. Which of the two is most likely to act and react in a way that matches what you said you stand for? Or hey, you can just sulk in the corner and put out on social media all the posts that call for a return to an alternate universe that does not exist, where the perfect man or woman rises up and suddenly shows up for the office. But that's not today. So what do? Look, something we have to consider here is that God does use imperfect people. I believe that. I'm an example of that. And the Bible is full of stories like that. And there's a great example in the prophet Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapters 2 and 3, we hear the story of Samuel as a young boy. He was dedicated by his parents to serve in the temple, and it was a time of upheaval. Let's just say the nation of Israel was not doing well. The chief priest was Eli, and Eli was what I would call a weak and somewhat broken man. Eli had two sons who also served as priests, and they were just heinous in their behavior. They abused the people. They were constantly abusing the women. They were taking from people so they could fatten themselves. It was awful. He would try to talk to them. He got nowhere. He basically was not doing a great job as a father, much less as a priest. Samuel was the young guy who was serving as his aide, if you will. Samuel wore the white ephod and did what Eli needed during the day. Samuel had a good heart, and he'd been dedicated by his parents. There's a story in 1 Samuel chapter 3 where Samuel lay down in bed at night, and suddenly he heard what we know from reading was the voice of God calling his name, Samuel. And he thought it was Eli because he didn't know what to think of that. So he ran down the hall, and Eli was already in bed, and he woke him, and Eli said, "I didn't call you, go back to bed." Did it the second time, exactly the same way. Samuel ran down the hall. Eli was getting a little frustrated with him, sent him back to bed. Happened a third time. The voice of God said, "Samuel." Well, Eli told him then, it must be God calling you. And when he calls, you need to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." He did that. And God revealed to him what he was going to do in the days to come. And Samuel began at that point to become the man of God that the books of 1 and 2 Samuel write about. My point in saying all that is this. It was Eli, the broken man, who was not at all perfect, who really had done some things that you look at and go, how does he serve? And yet he was the one in the position who then turned and did something incredibly meaningful by recognizing the voice of God was calling this young man and gave him the advice that he needed. In other words, Eli, the imperfect, gave what I would call perfect advice, and it became a matter of principle. It became a matter of changing the day. Look, I don't care if you like Trump or not. Answer me this. Are you better off now than you were several years ago? Because Joe Biden, he had over 5 decades of details, actual details on the books, policy positions and scandals, votes on the record that we can go back and read, soft on crime, hard on energy, wrong on foreign policy, terrible on taxes, one weird gaffe after another. But hey, no mean tweets. So he got to sit in his basement for a year, and when he did come out, it was to a micromanaged, kind of small-scale, low-energy environment with people sitting in masks inside their designated circles, all socially distanced from each other. It was epic weird, but yeah, nothing scary or mean, right? For the last 4 years, we've been living out the details. Because it is details, my friends. It is. If you're concerned with the candidate, if you're concerned about the personality of the candidate, if you're even concerned about whether or not the candidate is what you would consider to be a good enough person, still go back and look and decide, here are my principles, which of the two that are now up for the office is most likely to put my principles into action. I mean, it's hard to believe we're finally here. 2024, this is going to be a major election, and I do mean major, and I want to encourage you, you find the candidate, obviously, you find the candidate who at least appears to fit the bill for what you're looking for, and then look behind the veil and get away from all the shiny stump speeches, recognize they do have a record, both of them have a record, they've both voted before on other things, they've both taken action on several things. Start asking yourself, which one of them ever held down a job? Which one started a business? Which one ever made a payroll? Has either one ever served in the military? Have they worked for a charity? Have they done things in public in the past that, listen, who's sponsoring their campaign? Are they bullish on school choice, but yet taking contributions from the teachers union? Do they claim to be tough on crime, but they knelt down with BLM during the rioting? Do they claim to be for the free market, but they voted for the Green New Deal subsidies that prop up a whole section of the energy industry? Details, y'all. And when you get past all the ads and the billboards and the public speeches, and when you get past your feelings about personality, what details do you find? Because it is all about the details. And this 2024 election, it matters more than any that I think we've seen in decades. And if conservatives don't vote for their candidates based on policy, not personality, but policy, then the 2024 presidential election is going to mean more of the same. More of what we've been lamenting now for the last several years. Because, my friends, this is a turning time. We're at an inflection point. And the luxury of voting on personality, you don't have that. It's all about the details. That's my philosophy.